All right. Thank you all for braving COVID and showing up. I guess that's par for the course. I'm delighted that Nick Diakopoulos is here from Northwestern University and the Washington Post and Columbia University and the Bergen Institute of Technology, all of which places he holds appointments. But primarily he's on the faculty at the School of Communication in Communication Studies, Department of Communication Studies in Northwestern University. Before this, he was on the faculty at the University of Maryland, and has also been at a few other places on his way there after he got his PhD from Georgia Tech a few years ago. The remarkable thing about Nick is that he is a scholar in communication studies, and you know that's where his appointment is, but however his PhD is in computer science, so he spans the two fields better than anybody else I know. And I want to. He wrote a book that I want to plug. It's, I should get the title right, Automating the News, How Algorithms Are Rewriting the Media. And I expect that some of the things he's going to talk about have something to do with what's in the book, but I'm eager to hear him talk about that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, thanks. And I guess this should be on now. Thanks so much for the introduction, Jag. It's a pleasure to be here at the University of Michigan and to be able to have an opportunity to share with you some of my research related to computational journalism. So I run a research lab in the School of Communication, the Computational Journalism Lab, where we study, design, and build things related to algorithmic and automated news production. So I'm just going to kind of dive right in here. Jag mentioned I have a book out. Also do myself the courtesy of promoting it here. So I've just come off the better part of a couple of years writing this book, Automating the News, How Algorithms Are Rewriting the Media. And it really covers a lot of terrain. It's kind of a sampling of different things related to editorial data mining, how to use algorithms to find news stories, automated content production, so generation of written or visual stories based on structured data, news bots, so sort of the production of news information and how social bots can interact with people on social media around that information. And then sort of these last two topics, which are kind of the focus of today's talk, algorithms and news distribution in terms of how algorithms contribute to attention patterns and how people attend to news, and then investigating algorithms, this idea of algorithmic decision-making in society and the role that journalists can play in scrutinizing those algorithms and tracing sort of the lines of power through those algorithms. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to sort of tie these last two topics together in today's talk and share with you the results from a few studies where we're auditing algorithmic curation systems or algorithmic distribution systems to understand patterns and biases in sources, content, and attention. So I'm going to kind of start here with the two main platforms that drive quite a large share of attention to news information, Facebook and Google. So a few stats, 45% of US adults get news on Facebook, about 2/3 from social media. More than half of US adults get news from Google. Around the world, about a quarter of people say it's the main gateway to getting news information. And according to Parsley, which is a news analytics purveyor, about 70% of external traffic to news information comes through these two channels. So certainly these two platforms kind of dominate the algorithmic mediation of attention to news. So why does that matter? Let's consider one area that kind of demonstrates the awesome power of these platforms for mediating attention. This is a slide taken from a data scientist who was then at Facebook, describing a study that was done in late 2012 during the election period then, in which Facebook was interested in understanding the impact of dialing up the amount of hard news information people saw in their news feed. So they created an experiment where you can see they had kind of a control condition, which is like you see the normal amount of hard news in your news feed, versus a boosted condition where they kind of dialed up the amount of news, hard news that you would see in your news feed. And they looked at, they did a survey of people who were in the study, and they looked at the self-reported likelihood to vote. And what they found is that in the boosted condition, where people saw more news in their news feed, they tended to vote at higher rates, to turn out at higher rates. And in the top panel, you're seeing a differentiation they made in terms of how often people logged into Facebook. So if they were everyday users, the boost was a little bit less than if they were more, or is that me? Sorry if that's, is that my audio that's making that sound? Maybe? Yeah, let's just turn that off in case. I actually don't need, if I can, I don't know how to mute it, but all right. So, bottom line, these algorithmic systems for curating news information are potentially very powerful. Now, I don't mean to convey that Facebook is actually like manipulating elections, but this does kind of point in the direction of the potential of something like this to impact outcomes. You know, if you imagine sort of the razor-thin margins with which a state like Michigan was won in 2016, you wouldn't have to differentially target different communities very much in order to influence enough of a turnout that you want to influence in order to swing the vote. Of course, algorithms are everywhere now. They're used throughout the public and private sectors. They're used throughout the media system, from political message targeting to review moderation, trending algorithms, personalized aggregators, and so on. Certainly, they're used more broadly than that as well in criminal justice and in dynamic pricing, in urban planning, and on and on and on. And this kind of leads us to this idea of algorithmic accountability. You know, with the sort of pervasiveness in algorithms, not only in the media system, but also more broadly in society, you know, we can start asking questions like, well, how do we investigate algorithms? How do we explain algorithmic decisions that are occurring in different walks of life? And for researchers, journalists, and other stakeholders, can we start to characterize the biases, potential biases in the decision processes here, or trace the power flow through these systems, or understand the influence of these algorithms, either on individuals or in aggregate. So again, I'm largely going to be sort of applying this idea of algorithmic accountability to the media system itself. And I'm going to start by diving into Google a little bit. So remember, search is very important. About a third of news content is found via search, and more than half of Americans get news information from search. So there's a huge amount of power embedded in how Google, as the dominant search engine in the US, directs attention. So I started getting interested in search about 5 years ago after this paper came out. It was published in the PNAS in 2015, called the Search Engine Manipulation Effect, SEME. So what this study looked at was they created a mock search engine where the results in the search engine, there were 5 pages of results that users could interact with, and you're seeing A, B, C, D, E. Those are different conditions of the study. So in condition A, the first 2 pages would all be for information that was supporting or pro for one candidate, and then the last 2 pages of results were supporting the other candidate, and then switched for condition B, And then condition C would be the control, which was not favoring one candidate over the other. And what they found in this study, and they replicated this several times since then, is that conditions A and B tended to influence people to say that they would vote for the person who was featured on the top 2 pages of the rankings that they were shown. So this there was a bias in terms of supporting the people who were listed first in the rankings. Moreover, they found that about 3/4 of people didn't even recognize that these rankings were biased, but that about 1 in 4 recognized that conditions A or B were biased. So they actually added conditions D and E to see if they could mask the bias by introducing one result on the first page that contradicted the primary bias. And when they did that, so conditions D and E, they still found a very powerful effect. I think it was up to 24% of undecided voters could be swayed by these biased rankings, but in conditions D and E, only maybe 1% could recognize that there was a bias. So this is sort of my way of kind of coming into this topic and saying, like, these biased rankings could really impact the way that people are thinking about candidates, and maybe we should really start scrutinizing these things more closely. So one of the criticisms of this paper was that it lacked ecological validity, right? It was using a mock search engine. So as we started looking at this question in late 2015, we got interested in studying the real thing, right? So we were Googling for people like Hillary Clinton and other people who were in the primary. And we wanted to track different candidates and try to measure the degree of support or opposition for the candidate on their first pages of results, or on their first page of results. So basically, are the results at the top of the page supporting the candidate more so than results at the bottom of the page? And we started by looking at the entire field of candidates in late 2015 and collecting organic search results for those candidates. We then rated how favorable each result was with respect to the candidate and tabulated those results. So this is kind of an overview of what we found, aggregated by Republican candidates, Democrat candidates. The result rank is the ordering on the first page of results, and then we have that favorability score, which looked at basically how supportive the result was with respect to the candidate. And there's a couple patterns I just want to point out here. The first being that the blue is higher than the red. So overall, it tended to be that result pages for Democratic candidates were more supportive of the candidate than result pages for Republicans were supportive of Republican candidates. And also, both tend to have this shape where it's kind of sloped down to some extent, where it's more favorable at the top of the page than it is at the bottom of the page. And if you drill into the kind of results that are at the bottom of the page, you tend to start seeing things like news results there, criticisms of the candidates that are starting to pop up into the results page. Another way to look at this, kind of broken down by individual candidate. In this graph, you're seeing orange as result pages that were either con or very con, and then purple is pro or very pro. So you tend to see more orange for the Republicans and more purple for the Democrats. And you even see one Democrat, Bernie Sanders, who had 9 very pro results and 1 neutral result. So in some follow-up work, looking at search pages more broadly as a form of search media, we also got interested in how candidates were being represented visually. And I should mention, you can get more details on these studies in this chapter, which is listed as a PDF off my website. We started getting interested in images since we know that visual representation of candidates can also impact voter attitudes. And so on. I'm not going to get into those results here, but again, refer you to the chapter. What I want to focus on a little bit more now is this idea of this section of the results page that's dedicated to news. This is an old screenshot back when Google used to call it in the news. Now this is called top stories, and you'll probably recognize it more as a carousel pattern at the top of many of your results pages. Actually, some research suggests that almost 1 in 3 search result pages will have top stories inset. So I'm going to kind of drill in on top stories a little bit more now. We have a couple of research questions here. One was, do Google top stories provide a diverse set of sources and ideological perspectives? We want to know, given that this is really prime real estate at the top of the search rankings for a lot of these queries, we want to know what types of news sources are showing up there, and are there different ideological perspectives that pop up there? And the second question is, how does the Google Top Stories box actually shape attention to news information? Can we actually measure essentially the click-through rate on stories that are listed as top stories? Like, how much does it impact attention? So I'm going to talk about an audit study we did of Google to try to get at these questions. And the first issue with trying to audit Google is trying to come up with what's the set of queries you're going to audit for. So we decided to focus on queries related to hard news. So hard news basically includes stories about things like government, elections, global affairs, or macroeconomics, whereas soft news would be things about sports results, celebrities, or say updates on individual companies. These would not be considered hard news. Of course, there's a middle ground here as well, so there might be stories that are somewhere in between hard and soft. And the way we collected these was we looked at Google Trends every day for 1 month in November 2017, looked at the trending events, and then manually applied this hard news criterion for selecting 224 terms over the period of that month. So those were our inputs that we wanted to audit. So this is what the top stories carousel looked like at the time of the study. So it's three stories listed from left to right, and what we did was we issued these 224 queries once every minute for 24 hours. So on each day we were auditing a different subset of queries. So it wasn't 224 queries per day, but it was up to, I think, usually maybe 15 search terms per day. But for each day, we'd collect every minute, so kind of a high rate of collection there. And we collected all the organic links, the links in the top stories, as well as things like the source of the story and how recently it had been published. Overall, we collected about 6,300 articles this way. And here's what we sort of saw in terms of source concentration. So you can kind of get a feel here that this is the top, top 20 sources. CNN, New York Times, Washington Post dominating with about 20+% of articles. The impressions. An impression is defined as an article appearing once in one of our scrapes. So we see sort of a concentration along those national news sources, and then we have a little bit of a tail there. If you look at the top 20% of news sources, which would be the top 136 sources that accounted for 86% of all impressions, and so essentially, I think and 52% of impressions are covered by these top 20. So the sort of long story short is that there's a fair degree of concentration in the results that you get from Google in terms of the sources that it's steering you toward. Another thing I'm not going to delve into in too much detail here is that if you look at the query by query results, you see a potentially different distribution. So depending on what you're searching for, you might see a different concentration of attention across different sources. So if you're looking for like a technology-oriented keyword, you might, like Wired might show up there, or MIT Technology Review might show up there. Which kind of raises the question again of the importance of your query selection in terms of what you're putting into the search engine to audit. The next question we had was kind of related to this issue of ideological diversity. Is Google showing you a diverse array of perspectives in the news that it's surfacing? So to get at this, we drew on a data set that had been published by Facebook, looking at ratings of the 500 most shared news organizations on Facebook, where they measured the alignment of the preference for sharing of that source with a stated affiliation for about 10 million Facebook users. So the rating ranged from -1, which is more left-leaning, to +1 for more right-leaning. Again, this isn't, this is a measure of the audience for the news source rather than a direct measure of the news source itself. But those are the ratings that we're using for measuring ideological diversity. And we applied these ratings to the sources of the news articles that we had collected from our audit. And here's what we found. About 62% of the impressions came from sources with left-leaning audiences, and about 11% came from sources with right-leaning audiences, and about 26% of the impressions were from sources that we didn't observe or didn't have ratings from this Facebook data set. So you might be wondering, well, sure, maybe Google's algorithm is biased towards selecting left-leaning sources. That's one hypothesis. We can't measure that because we're not Google. We don't know how they've built that. But you might also be thinking, well, what if there's just more news content being produced on the left? Maybe that's why we see a higher prevalence of left-leaning sources. Maybe Google is just reflecting that greater availability of news information on the left. So we tried to attack this question by creating a statistical baseline comparison where we took a very broad sampling of news articles online from a data set called GDELT, which monitors news information from hundreds of thousands of different sources around the world. We use the same queries as we use to audit Google to go collect articles from GDELT, and that creates our sort of baseline sampling of like what everyone is producing from an information standpoint online. So kind of a larger universe of news. And here's how the comparison looks. So we can compare, instead of looking at impressions, because there's no notion of an impression from GDELT, we look at the number of articles. So at an article level, we had about 52% Google articles on the left, 16% on the right, whereas GDELT had about 11% of articles on the left and not quite 5% on the right. You can see also the number of unknown articles, and particularly for GDELT, there was a high fraction of articles that weren't known. But in the sort of result column, you can see comparing Google to GDELT, you see a 3.2% increase, sorry, a ratio of 3.2 as many left as right-leaning articles on Google, whereas there's only 2.2 times as many left-leaning as right-leaning articles on GDELT. So if we kind of take GDELT as a very broad distribution of a lot of media that's published, there is a left-leaning bias. I mean, there's more news produced on the left, we think. But Google maybe concentrates it even a little bit more to be left-leaning. So I wouldn't say that this proves anything per se nefarious about Google. I don't necessarily know that they're trying to show people more left-leaning news. But there's something going on here in terms of the way the algorithm is working and drawing attention to different parts of perspectives from the information ecosystem. Question, yes?
So I'm going to suggest that this would indicate to me that the definition of left and right is not balanced.
Can you say more?
Well, the current political parties define some notion of left and right. And if you take the spectrum of what the Republican Party stands for, you can say that's right. The Democratic Party, you can say that's left. But from an ideas or a news classification perspective, I don't know what the definition of left and right should be and whether that should map to party positions. And to the extent that the Democratic Party also encompasses a good part of the center and the Republican Party doesn't, this might simply be the fact that you have more left-leaning articles may simply be a function of the fact that anything that's democratic is being marked as left. And so the left encompasses a larger part of the idea space.
Yeah, and I guess what I would add to that is also that our measure of left versus right is an audience-based measure. So there are more articles on Google that are shared by people on the left than on the right, if that makes sense. So there's sort of another level, another layer of indirection there. It's a little tricky to interpret. I take your point. I mean, this is far from a perfect kind of labeling strategy. I think there's probably a whole line of work that could be dedicated to making this assessment more comprehensive. And there are, of course, different ways of measuring left versus right bias, as I learned this morning. But yeah. So to kind of drive forward, I mean, so who cares? So what? Maybe there's a difference in source concentration or perhaps an ideological perspective. But what about the second question of how does Google actually shape attention to news information? To get at this, we looked at data provided from a collaborator, Chartbeat. It's a news analytic provider which tracks traffic to news articles. And so Chartbeat shared data with us on time-stamped data indicating the refer for all traffic to each article in our sample that we had scraped from Google for the 24-hour period after which we first observed that article in our data. Chartbeat had coverage for about 42% of our articles, so like it was pretty good coverage, but not everything. And we looked at the referral data from Chartbeat from the moment after it was first observed in our linked data. Importantly, so if you look at our results page here, Chartbeat data, referrer data can't differentiate between a click from a link in the top story section of the page from a click in the link on the organic section of the search page. We just get one aggregate refer number, like this is the number of clicks that came from Google to this link. They do differentiate other Google services, like if the click came from Google News, that would be in a different bucket. But in terms of Google search result pages, it all gets lumped into one aggregate bucket. So we make use of the presence or visibility of a link on the organic search results in our attention model, trying to look at the attention patterns around top stories. What we ended up doing was creating a model of top stories impressions and organic impressions of articles as predictors of referrals to the article from Google. So again, using that Chartbeat data. And it's pretty standard statistical modeling using a negative binomial regression for over-dispersed count data. Importantly, we needed to group on query term because attention varies quite a lot in terms of what the query is. So during our data collection, this was like the time span when Matt Lauer, the Matt Lauer story hit. And so like the amount of click-through on that story is like this incredibly large number, whereas a lot of the other queries had some fraction of that. So we had to control for the variability between search terms in this model. We ended up building two models, one model with all of the top stories and organic impressions, and then one model with the top stories impressions broken out by their position. So position 1 would be on the left, position 2 in the middle, and position 3 on the right. And so let me show you the results of those models. Here we have model 1 and model 2. Model 1, again, with just the organic impressions and the top stories impressions. The beta coefficient indicates the effect of the independent variable on the referrals, and this should be interpreted as a log of the ratio of how much the response variable is expected to change for 1 unit change in the predictor. So for model 1, one additional impression on the top stories, which again, we're measuring an impression every minute. So one additional impression on top stories is associated with a 0.17% increase in referrals. Again, because each impression is happening once per minute, if you have an article showing up for an hour, that would be 60 top stories impressions. That might be expected to receive a 10 to 11% boost in the number of referrals. Organic impressions, just to compare coefficients, were a little bit less powerful in terms of driving traffic, although not by much. Also very important driver of traffic to be in organic results. When we break out by the position in the top stories, we can see that actually it's the center position, the number 2 slot in the middle, which drives the most increase in referrals, whereas the left and the right position are on par with or even a little bit less powerful than showing up in the organic search results. So that's kind of what I wanted to share about our Google study. There's a couple other studies I want to talk to that I think kind of elaborate ideas around attention and exposure. So I'm going to share the next study, which looks at Apple News, where we've been trying to understand sort of the Apple News is kind of interesting because it has both a component that's algorithmic, the trending stories section, as well as a component that's driven by editors, the top stories component. And we're kind of interested in auditing the patterns of content that show up when you have an algorithmic versus an editorially curated aspect. We're also interested in things like, is Apple doing things like personalization or localization of content? And similarly to our studies of Google, we're kind of interested in things like the source concentration and things like that. So do we have any Apple News users here? Anyone? No one uses Apple News. There's like 95 million people using Apple News and no one in this room. Okay. It is actually an important source of traffic, not exactly on par with Google and Facebook, but a growing source of traffic for news organizations. This gives you a sense for what it looks like, since we don't have any users in the room. You see top stories when you first open the app, and then as you scroll down, you see trending stories after that. And there's some other sections as well, like you can click into News Plus, which is more magazines, and you can follow specific stories. If you continue scrolling down past trending, you'll see a section called For You, which is explicitly personalized based on your interaction patterns with the app. We didn't look so much at the For You section. We were mostly focused on top stories and trending stories. And these are some of the questions that we had. We wanted to know some things related to the mechanism of the algorithm here, like how often does Apple News update content? Is it using personalization or localization? And then we also had some content-related questions, like what's the concentration and distribution of sources and what topics are shown most often? Again, we were interested in comparing across the editorially, manually driven component, top stories, and the algorithmic component and the trending stories. So what made auditing this a little bit more tricky is that there's no public API and you can't just scrape it. There's no website for Apple News. And Apple kind of has it locked down in that regard. But we were able to use an app QA program called Appium. So Appium lets you simulate an iPhone in software. So it's a little environment. You can load it up and then you can launch Apple News within that simulated Apple device. And so by scripting Appium, we were able to essentially launch Apple News periodically over time, and then essentially copy out the links to different stories that were showing up in different sections of the app. So this allowed us to do extended data collection and also to test things like localization, since you can simulate the location of a user in Appium. We also used some crowdsourcing approaches on Mechanical Turk for tests of personalization, because we wanted to know if different people at the same time were seeing different versions of the app. So we would put a task on Turk that asked people to open the app all at the same time and then take a screenshot and upload that. And then we're able to see 50 different versions of Apple News across the country at the same minute. And assess personalization that way. So just to kind of dive into the results summary here, Again, comparing algorithmic versus editorial curation, we found no evidence of localization. So both of these are localized at the national level. Like Apple News in the UK is different than Apple News in the US, but within the US, there's no regionalization or localization of stories in either of those sections, the top stories or trending. We also found no evidence of personalization. So no evidence that Apple is implicitly personalizing any of the information in those two sections. In the trending sections section, we found about 3,100 stories in total, whereas in the top story section, we found 1,300 articles in total. So this kind of gives you a feel for how frequently the content in trending stories is churning. It's much more frequent than top stories. And actually, I'm not going to show it here, but you can kind of see the update frequency is much more continuous and steady for trending, whereas for the editorial section, it's punctuated. They update it like 4 times a day with maybe some minor updates in between. We found roughly the same number of unique sources in either section, about 83 and 87, although they were a different set of 83 and 87. So there were only 40 sources that we observed in both sections, and then the remainder in either was unique to that section. And this last line, we looked at the concentration of sources, and we found about 75% of the sources, the top 10 sources comprise about 75% of the stories, whereas the top 10 sources for top stories was only about 55, 56%. So greater concentration of attention in those top 10 sources for trending. If we look at the top 20% of sources, those tend to account for about 80% of articles in either section. Again, it was a little bit more concentrated in trending than it was in top stories. I should have mentioned, sorry, forgot to mention this detail. We collected, for this audit, we collected data every 20 minutes, which was the update frequency that we had measured in our initial tests over a 2-month span in early 2019. So here's kind of what the sources look like. Top stories in the upper left and trending stories in the lower right. Can anyone see what are the 2 sources that appear in both? We've got CNN and the Washington Post. So there's only, in the top 10, there's only 2 sources that appear in both top 10s. Yeah.
So when you're talking about personalization, are these the editors, are they tracking the system for a long time, or is that you mean talk about personalization in terms of like their geographic location and so on?
In terms of their geographic location and anything that would be implicit in the way that's stored in their user history of using the app.
Yeah. So not necessarily people that are actually totally using Apple.
No, they are people who potentially are normally using Apple News. We didn't measure like their user history, but so we don't actually know. We're not controlling for the degree of use of Apple News. That's a good point. One thing I kind of wanted to point out that was something that was a bit surprising that we didn't initially, we weren't necessarily expecting initially. You can see from the upper left chart, most of the sources in top stories are from national outlets, maybe with the exception of LA Times, which is sort of borderline national regional outlet. But they also included some other local and regional publications like Chicago Tribune or the Miami Herald there as well. And those accounted for about 20 of the 87 sources we saw there. In the trending section of the app, we basically didn't see any local or regional sources whatsoever. None of the sources there are ones you might consider to be local or regional. So this does kind of point out the disparity in attention that Google is sending to different types of publishers with a tendency towards national publishers in these top ranked sources. You can also start to see some differences in terms of hard versus soft news here. So you see things like BuzzFeed, HuffPost, Vanity Fair, Newsweek, E-Online, so more entertainment-oriented types of things showing up in the trending section, whereas you have more kind of straight-up news like NBC News, USA Today in the top stories section. So a little bit of a differentiation in the type of news information there as well. Here's another view comparing source rates in top and trending for the top 20 in terms of the difference between top and trending of the prevalence of that source. So one thing that pops out at the top is Fox News rarely shows up in the top stories, but trends a whole lot in the trending section. You see things like People rarely shows up in top stories, but shows up in trending a lot. CNN shows up in both places a lot, but it trends quite a bit as well, and so on. So yeah, that gives you a little bit of a comparison between what's doing well in which section. Again, just to kind of point out some of these differences, you see things like, where is it? BuzzFeed up there is almost non-existent in top stories, but very prevalent in trending stories. So again, we kind of see this tendency for trending stories to reflect more soft news kinds of things. Oftentimes, the section refers to celebrities like Donald Trump or politicians like Donald Trump and his family, shocking or sensationalistic stories. Florida Man shows up a lot in trending stories, if you're familiar with that meme. And whereas on the top stories section, these actually reflected more substantive political issues on topics like the Affordable Care Act, measles was in the news, border wall, sanctuary cities, and so on. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about quickly before kind of opening it up is a very recent pilot study we ran looking at news curation on Alexa. So we're kind of interested in smart speakers because some recent surveys have shown that actually more and more Americans are getting news from these devices. 1 in 4 Americans owns a smart speaker, including things like Alexa or Google Home. And 74%, this is based on an NPR survey from late 2019, 74% of Americans reported they relied on smart speakers and other voice assistants to answer general questions, and 42% said they often sought news information. So even though most traffic to news is still coming through Google and Facebook, these are sort of a growing device of interest in terms of conduit for news information. Something else that's a little bit different about the interaction modality here. When you get a search result on an Alexa device, you typically just get one result. You get the top result. So whereas for something like Google search, you're browsing and you're scanning a set of top results, on Alexa it's really just one thing that you're getting. So it kind of raises the stakes in terms of the quality of information that's being returned from the algorithmic curator. To audit Alexa, we first needed to know how people ask Alexa for news information. So we did an initial crowdsourced study where we took Google trending topics and we asked people, how would you ask Alexa for information about this topic? And we collected something like 700 or 800 responses and then clustered them down based on similar phrasing to these 4. So what happened, what is going on, can you tell me about, and what is new? And of course, depending on what the actual topic of the query is, we needed to substitute the appropriate preposition in order to have the query make sense. And we actually found out that the query response is sensitive to the preposition. So you can't just use the beginning of the phrase. Like if you said, what happened, Trump? Like it wouldn't understand you in the same way as what happened with Trump. So we found it to be sensitive to that. So it was important to substitute those prepositions. We then did a 2-week query in late 2019, 2-week audit in late 2019, where we took the top 20 trending topics from Google, and we substituted them into these query patterns, and then we set up a system computer to do text-to-speech for each of these queries. and then the Alexa was over on this side, and it would light up, and it would speak its response, and then the computer would record that response and then transcribe it. So that's how we audited the system and were able to look at the results. So kind of top line results here. Overall, doing pretty good with the response rate. About Alexa was able to respond in 92% of the queries. A no response would be when the speaker fails to even sort of acknowledge that you've asked anything or doesn't provide any response to the user query. For those 92%, if we break those down, 70% of those were relevant, meaning that it shared a response that related to the question and provided a useful answer to the user query. And then 16% of responses were irrelevant, meaning that that Alexa had oftentimes failed to understand the question. 14% of responses provided no information. That's basically like Alexa saying, sorry, I'm not sure about that, or something similar. So that's kind of the overall. And then we sort of broke that down by the query phrasing. And you can see some differences that show you the way you ask the question impacts Alexa's response relevance. So for things like, can you tell me about, or what happened? We got a bit higher response relevance than when we ask, what is going on, or what is new? And you can see differences in terms of the relevance rate, the irrelevance rate, and also the no information rate. We also looked at the information sources of where Alexa was pulling from. Most responses had unknown provenance, as you can sort of see from this chart. In the darker blue on the right, most query phrasings had unknown information sources. Overall, Wikipedia is actually the most prevalent individual information source, provided about almost 19% of the responses. So Alexa currently leaning on Wikipedia quite heavily. Responses from Amazon, so those are in the light blue, or the very light blue. Whoops. Put this back on. Responses from Amazon were either references to things like Amazon Music albums or Amazon deals and so on. The news category, so the dark blue, the little sliver in here, you can see very few of the responses actually were sourced to news sources. And you can also see that depending on the query phrasing, sometimes you get a news source and sometimes you don't. The news sources accounted for only 1.4% of the sources that we observed, so very kind of rare. And these were from only two news sources, Reuters and the Washington Post. So very often when you're asking about stuff going on in the news, again, these are queries about Google trending topics, you're not getting a source from the news. You're getting a source from Wikipedia or sometimes from other things. There were a variety of other sources in this other category as well, things like IMDb, World Atlas, and reference.com. So kind of a smattering of other sources that Amazon is pulling on. Okay, so I'm going to wrap things up, and we'll have a few minutes for questions. But I kind of wanted to land on a few thoughts that I think are kind of interesting to discuss based on these findings. So I think the first point I'd like to make relates back to this idea of source concentration and attention concentration. So the concentration of sources kind of points out the role of curators like Google and Apple News in helping to pick winners and losers in the news industry. Our results on Google showed that there can be a substantive boost in attention based on placement in the top stories and the top stories section of results. And so top outlets like CNN, the New York Times, and Washington Post are reaping greater attentional rewards from these platforms. I should also note that there are some confounds in this study and in studies like this. And we can't really pin this entirely on the algorithmic curators, right? We can't say it's Google's fault per se. Publishers' behavior and content also may play a role in terms of what gets picked up and what gets more attention on the curator. Jag mentioned during the intro, I spent some time at the Washington Post recently. I was on sabbatical there in the fall. And I can tell you from having kind of seen it on the inside a bit, there's a lot of effort and attention given to optimizing and doing the technical SEO that's needed to get your content to show up on Google in search results. And of course, not every publisher can put those kind of engineering resources into ensuring that their content gets ranked highly. I think concentration is also important to industry. You know, as I mentioned, we didn't observe many local news outlets in our results, actually either on Google or on Apple News. And this raises, I think, really interesting and important questions about the ability of local news outlets to gain exposure on platforms like Apple and Google. And this is especially important, I think, in addressing issues like local news deserts. So we're seeing sort of a collapse in the local news ecosystem. It's very difficult to be a sustainable news organization on the local level. And I think it's appropriate to ask the question of, to what extent are these algorithmic curators potentially contributing to that by draining attention away from local news media toward more national outlets? Of course, you know, the concentration of attention, I think, is also relevant to individuals and society. You know, we can ask the question of, is it really good that we're all paying attention to the same 20 news sources for, you know, 80+% of the articles that are showing up? I don't exactly want to go down the whole filter bubble route. I think the filter bubble is flawed in several ways, but I think it's also worth thinking about this broader notion of just a very kind of constrained set of sources where a lot of attention is being drawn to. The second point about query sensitivity in search media, you know, this kind of comes up in the context of both the audits of Google and also of Alexa that we did, which is to say that these results are all very sensitive to the type of query that you use. And I think that dependency on query kind of means that moving forward doing these types of studies, we really need to start thinking about how input query biases might kind of have some kind of impact on the results that we're measuring. So in some more recent work, we're actually trying to address this by using surveys to get at the types of queries that different groups of people may use. So maybe we survey left-leaning people for the types of queries that they would use to get information. We survey right-leaning people for the types of queries they would use to get information. And then we can audit the search engine for left versus right queries and compare the types of content that show up. But I think in terms of the audit methodology, I think what we're kind of working towards is more sophistication in thinking through the types of queries that we're auditing. The final point I want to make is kind of related to this the Apple News study, where we're kind of comparing algorithmic versus editorial logics of curation. So, you know, the editorially selected top stories section exhibited more diverse and more equitable source distribution than the algorithmically selected trending stories. During our data collection period, we saw that human editors chose from a slightly wider array of sources than the algorithm behind the trending stories, and also that they distributed attention more equitably across those sources. And perhaps, you know, maybe the more intuitive distinction between these two sections in terms of these logics was that the difference in content, right? The hard news versus soft news distinction, right? So trending stories uniquely included soft news pieces about celebrities and entertainment, while top stories included hard news topics like international stories and news about political policy and so on. So, you know, as a whole, Apple News has both of these strategies built into it, right? It has the the editorial logic, which is kind of getting you more of the hard news, and the trending logic, which is kind of getting you more of the soft news. And actually what we didn't look at closely was the For You section, which is kind of getting you the personalized news. And if you kind of start thinking about it like almost like a newspaper with different sections for different people, it's kind of aggregating different editorial perspectives into the same app. And so from a design perspective, actually it looks like Apple is doing pretty well in terms of trying to bring different editorial perspectives into the same interaction space for users to consume information. So I am going to stop there. Thank you for your attention. Please see these references if you're interested in any of the methodological details. I mostly focused on results today, but please feel free to read into that and be in touch later with any questions or follow-ups. So thanks very much. Maybe we have a few minutes for questions.
A few questions.
Thanks, Nick. This was great. So I guess some of these I have like a number of questions that are maybe not as well formed and sort of related to each other. But the point about the national versus local kind of nationalization of our politics is broader than I think the news media. And so I guess the question is to what degree you think that these aggregators are, like, yes, they are more biased towards national, but is that more so than what is the demand from the consumers? And I guess sort of related to that, the study, the use of GDELT, I thought was really cool. But the other aspect of this is then you're equating all of the sources, but there might be certain sources that are kind of more popular or more seen more authoritative than the others. So I wonder if there is some room in weighting by, I don't know, like ComScore, some other data where that will give us a sense of indeed if Google News is more kind of biased than GDELT. And I guess kind of more broadly, and you touch up on that at the end of like editorial versus top trending. I guess where do you see that kind of trade-off and balance between giving us our broccoli and serving us what we need, and have to think about that more broadly.
Yeah, I mean those are great questions. Yeah, the broccoli question. I mean, again, I kind of think Apple News is doing a pretty good job with this, because in order to get to the soft stuff, remember, top news is the first thing you see, and then trending is second. So you have to go through the hard stuff to get to the soft stuff. So I mean, I think that's telling that Apple News kind of set it up that way. And I mean, I think they've done a reasonable job of like combining different ways of curating news into the same space where you can just kind of swipe through and get at it. In terms of the GDELT, so I didn't show all the results here. We tried to account for sources that publish more frequently. And if you want to see that comparison, you can dive into the paper, but we did also make that comparison. It was kind of similar in terms of the top line result. I appreciate the idea to look at ComScore to kind of weight based on attention. I guess I don't know how good the ComScore coverage is and whether or not we would, I mean, it's probably good enough to get a sense for how we could weight that by attention or by size of outlet and things like that. And then, yeah, this question of like, well, isn't the demand for politics national already? And maybe yeah, for elections, and maybe these systems are just kind of reflecting that propensity to want the more national view. I don't know, I'm gonna have to think about that some more. I mean, I think there's like a lot of potential follow-up work here to do, particularly on the local. Again, we weren't necessarily looking for this local national distinction. It was kind of just like, whoa, that's okay, we weren't expecting that, but huh. So I think there's like some follow-up work there to do to design an audit to really get at, like, if someone is searching explicitly for the local thing, how often do you get like a national version of that versus does Google actually feature the local version of that? So I think that's like that's good future work. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I have a research ethics related question about the left-right distinction you make. I mean, there's lots of studies which argue that, like, right, that these borders are not so clear. It's very contextual, time dependent, not so stable, changes. Have you seen like this research being used, for instance, by politicians or other kinds of actors to argue, for instance, as Google is leftist and Google needs to change their system to show more news, which is, has this research been, how has it circulated? Or, yeah, can you reflect a bit on that maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question. It's something I thought about as we were getting ready to publish this at Chi last year. On one level, like we absolutely did not approach this research from a political motivation. So, I mean, we measured what we measured and we reported it. And we tried to do so in a thoughtful way and in a way that wouldn't be misinterpreted. But, of course, people read it in the way that they want to read it. That particular aspect of that study did get reported on by many on the right. Including Fox News and some others. I'm not aware that it's been cited in any of the congressional testimony or anything like that. There are other studies that kind of show similar things in that regard. But, you know, I think it's, from my own sort of position of research ethics, again, I think, you know, we're just trying to describe what we saw and to include the appropriate nuance for interpreting it and making sure it's not misinterpreted. And I think that's probably about the best we can offer as researchers. I certainly don't think that researchers shouldn't do this kind of work if it has political valence. But you should be aware that you might get some attention that you don't want if you do this kind of work. So I don't know if that's satisfying or not. It's kind of where I landed.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, thanks.